welcome to ABA Inside Track's Book Club. Thank you so much for joining the Behavior Analytic podcast that talks about mostly research articles, but every season we pull out one of these books, and for our patrons, we get together and we share our thoughts on a book related to the field. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and I am joined by my book club regulars. Anybody, I swear, I have some.
I'm waiting for Alan.
Oh, well, okay. I'm Alan Haberman.
Hey, Alan. Alan's like the most book club of regulars.
He's the book clubbiest of all.
Of all the
I'm
book
the
clubbers.
book club guy. Quotes.
So you get to go first. Then it's me, Jackie.
And it's me, Diana.
Oh boy. Well, if you can you can tell everyone is just coming back from a long day in the coal mines, which is weird because you think we'd have better jobs as BCBAs, but I don't know. You get a job you can get these days. And we are here to talk all about the book voted on by patrons, Look Me in the Eye by John Elder Robison, who I think in everything we've published so far, we called him Robinson, but that
just
is wrong.
Just the one time, I think.
Oh, just one time? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
After reading his memoir, we know how to spell and say his last name. So this was, for our February choices, it was sort of a pop psychology month was the theme. So we had a couple different options of things that were a little less behavior analytic, a little lighter, kind of a nice break in these cold winter months. And Look Me in the Eye won, and it is a memoir. The subtitle is My Life with Asperger's. So we've never done a memoir, so this is going to be an interesting kind of change of pace. But I think if we see this book as, an example of one person's, life story in which they had a disability that was never identified until they were fully adult, and we think about it as a time capsule of what different individuals were treated like in the 60s and 70s. And also, I promised Jackie we will talk for a long time about her favorite band, Kiss, who makes a really long chapters all about them. We're going to talk all about 70s glam and horror rock or whatever Kiss counts as.
I want to say that this was my choice of book,
and
I picked it for a very specific reason.
Okay.
And so...
It was Kiss, I just said that.
It was not. It was because up until this point, I had read very little about the perspective of what life is like for an autistic individual or for an Asperger's individual, right? So even though I went through 3 years of a master's program, 7 years, it felt like, but I don't think it was really 7. I think it was like 4 years of a doctoral program, right? And this is not discrediting where I went to school, right? But I think the perspective of our client and this specific perspective of the author being autistic, right, and moving through the world with these deficits, right, and strengths, I think can provide a really, I think, different, more broader lens for clinicians to conceptualize what their clients might be going through, right? So this is something that I had not thought of, that my experience moving through the world might be like completely, vastly different than the clients that I serve moving through the world, just based on, even auditory processing, right? Visual processing, what I find to be annoying versus not annoying, right? I think I sometimes, as a younger practitioner, assume that we all had the same experience, which is 100% not true, right? I'm hoping that nobody has that sort of closed-mindedness now. I think we're doing better.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common skill that one develops, is the idea of, oh, wait a minute, everything's not the same as what I'm doing? Oh,
right.
Wait, like that's... Maybe not everybody, but it does.
But that doesn't mean
one.
people generalize it to their professional practice.
Right.
That's very true.
100%
very true.
Right. So it's actually funny that I did this work on myself outside of my professional practice before it even dawned on me to think about it within my professional practice. Right. So, and so I think for me, I have been trying to read a lot of these books and get a lot of perspectives on what the autism experience is. So when I'm teaching, because I don't have autism, right, and I don't know what that experience is, I can use those experiences from people who've,
Mhm.
who live it to give a more well-rounded and accurate depiction of what I should be doing as a clinician.
Mhm.
And so this book, we had the author of this book come talk to our campus about neurodiversity in the classroom at Regis, and I found his what he talked about in that. It was very brief. It was only an hour discussion, like very eye-opening. And so I wanted to read this book to see how I could incorporate how his experience is probably very similar to other experience, maybe not the same, right? But I think there are a lot of themes, like common themes, that come along with having a diagnosis of one thing or another, right? Because you have to hit all those traits, so you might experience life differently than I have, and so I can use that then to inform not only my practice, how I view my clients, but how I might modify treatment plans because of what I now know about the experience and how what I think should be something is not necessarily what should be, right? So that's why I chose this book. That was very long-winded. I'm so sorry.
So you chose to put it in the poll.
Yeah, but I knew it was going to win.
You knew it was going to win, huh? What did you do? Who'd you pay off?
I paid all the people off. But yeah, so that's why I chose this book. I did not know that he was brothers with Augustine Burroughs, who is the author of Running with Scissors, so very talented family.
You would not know that because Augustine Burroughs is not the same name as Robison.
Right,
and you have to have,
he changed his name.
He's changed his name, but you wouldn't necessarily know it just from looking at the titles.
No, and then they
authors.
say forward by Augustine Burroughs, and they don't say brother of the author.
Yeah. So
have you guys read Running with Scissors?
I have. It's really good.
I was disturbed by the title. That is not what you're supposed to do with scissors.
I've always
and
been
I
quite disturbed by
the
title and haven't been able to read it.
No,
for
I
that
actually read
reason,
it. It's a very good book. It's a memoir of his childhood. So
his seems even more traumatic.
Yep. So his memoir is much more traumatic than this memoir. But it's interesting to see the parallels, right?
Yeah.
For their common experience, but also their vastly different experience, right? Because John was much older and left the house when Augustine was young.
Yeah.
So
I'm gonna read it.
It's really good.
If we ever do a movie night, we might watch the film because it got.
Oh, I like that.
There's a movie too.
It had Alec Baldwin, Annette
really?
Bening.
What was Alec Baldwin?
The alcoholic father.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alec.
I don't know. Reading this memoir, I did not get the sense that their father was an Alec Baldwin type. I don't know.
Well, and then Brian Cox, the guy, I don't know if you know him as an actor.
Love Brian Cox, yeah.
He's the unorthodox therapist that we hear about in this book. So,
who's Brian Cox?
Yeah.
What has Brian Cox been in? Isn't he on the Succession show? Or is that somebody else?
I don't know, but this is beyond the scope of what we're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective as a professor and a clinician, I think it's important and vital if you're going to be working with the autistic population to get their experience, right? And so I think a lot of the things that we can pull from this book can help us understand where there might be some resistance to how we might prescribe some treatments, right? And see it from a different angle and maybe make some changes or not, but at least be able to have that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think to your point, Jackie, certainly we want to get the perspective from our client as best we can, but depending on the age of the client, the communication abilities of your client, it's not necessarily going to be as direct. So sources like this, where you can sort of just like quickly digest the experience of someone, is a perspective that you can sort of add to your knowledge base, and it can allow you to sort of think of questions and think of. I think what I found fascinating about the book was the idea of not just, oh, this is the perspective of someone, an autistic individual, so much as this is the perspective of an autistic individual and their life, not even their full life, because he has lived many years after this book. She is still alive to this day, has written more books since then. But the scope, because so many of us, I think, we work with a client for a year or 2 or 3, and then they move on to another school, or they move on to another company, or they move. And it's sort of like, well, that was my moment in time. Or we each get really good at, like, I'm great with preschoolers, or I'm great with adolescents, or I'm good with pre-vocational skills. and we lose the sense of people as organisms that grow and live and have many, many experiences for a long time, and we are only a bit player in their overall life. And we're hoping to be like an important bit player, but at the end, we're just a small chunk of everything that's going to happen in their life. And I think sometimes it's hard to take that into perspective, because usually we're working with a client, we're the star of the movie,
Right.
But we're not remembering that they're going to do a lot more beyond us.
Yeah. All right, let's get into it.
Yeah. Well, we usually start kind of, with overall thoughts. So Alan, were you familiar with this book, or Diana, were you familiar with this book before? I just remember seeing the cover at like Borders back when that was a bookstore and being like, what's this book about?
Oh no, Barnes.
I'm leaving. This looks like an Oprah book club. I don't know if I want to read this, was sort of my impression years and years ago. I think when this book kind of first hit, it was on all the shelves with the kid with the scrunchy face.
I don't remember seeing it in a bookstore.
I never saw it in the bookstore either.
I remember reading the prologue at some point, because that like opening line of "Look me in the eye, young man." I'm like, every behavior analyst needs to read that line with like, it is not something we need to move beyond that as our like go-to for like joint attention and things like that. But I quickly realized I hadn't read much more of this. But it was, I like that it was very frank. And I think that he, as an author, does a very good job of being upfront about the fact that I don't remember exactly any of this, but I knew these people really, really well. So I may not have it exactly right, but I have it right. Like, it is as good as you're going to get, and it's all true. And then I really like how sometimes he's very frank about how he, at that point in his life, would have described a situation internally or to himself, like how Varmint wasn't damaged. You mean your little brother wasn't injured?
Right.
But just like using language that we wouldn't consider typical of how we talk about, especially an adult talk about their younger sibling and things like that. So there are just lots of moments like that in the book that are really, really strong in presenting that, like, I am still an author who is atypical. I am neurodivergent. I am not the type of person that you will have interacted with or seen the point of view from often. And you need to remember that. And he does a good job of dropping that in there occasionally.
One thing I loved, and I can't forget about it, is when they talked about how when he was younger and the grown-ups were saying that somebody had died and he had laughed.
Mm-hmm.
And then they said, "Oh, you're so evil for laughing." Mm-hmm. But what he did then, I thought was like so like mind-boggling, was that he's like, "This is what I was thinking. Mm-hmm. Oh man, that's sad, but I'm not too sad because I don't know them. That's all how we feel." Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right? Let's be honest. And then he's like, "Oh, I'm glad it wasn't my family. Oh, I'm glad it wasn't my brother. Oh, I'm glad it wasn't me." Sigh of relief, laugh. Like that, I was like, of course that would happen, right?
Yeah.
I just thought that was so, like, poignant.
Yeah. And I like how he puts it back. And he's like, I think it's hypocritical when people have this outpouring of, like, extreme emotion for someone they didn't know. Mm-hmm. Like, that just doesn't make sense to me. And I think it's disingenuous. And it's like, well, okay, maybe I'm not going to disagree with you there. Sometimes it is.
Yeah.
I think one of the strengths of this book as a memoir, because when it was picked, I was a little nervous because it's not a science book in the way we've read other books before, and certainly there are a lot of chapters here that I look at my notes and I've shared my notes with folks. I've seen them. I write everything I can think of, and I had chapters where I was like, he's writing about making not video games. He's writing about making toys. Like there's we're not going to talk about this for 30 minutes. Like, even us, and we're good at tangents. But I loved how it was, life moments interspersed with those chapters, like the one you were describing, Jackie, of sort of just like quick tangent. I want to talk about how I think of this, or how I process this event, or what I think of when people, tell me this fact, or how I feel about being Aspergian, as an adult. So like these great chapters that just almost are like, the Saved by the Bell timeout. I'm going to just pull it back. I'm going to describe a feeling, or I'm going to describe a thought process I had. And I thought those were so fascinating. I felt like I gained so much. It was almost like the equivalent of, I wish everyone could do that when you're doing like an intake or an interview. They could be like, time out 1 second. I'm going to describe this really salient process I go through when this happens. It's like, oh, thank you for doing my job for me. This is amazing. Like all of this great, report on your private events, and it's all very clear, and your language is so precise. This is so great. Like I feel like I know you in a way that I wouldn't have just from reading your anecdotes or just from hearing some like general statements about how people reacted to you. So that format I thought really made the book so fascinating and really fly too, because like every chapter something different happened.
And he also, he doesn't have the vocabulary for it, but he talks about learning to mask and learning like, oh, I had learned by this point in my life that people expected me to behave this way. And I was much more successful when I did this. So I did it all the time. Like that's a great like report of internal events and growth and
also a little bit of sadness too, though, that he had to mask, right? So I think that's something else for us as clinicians that we can pull from this book. Is that it may appear that our clients are doing better because they're hiding their behaviors that they want to engage in, but maybe it's time for us to kind of take a step back and accept those behaviors, right? For just behaviors that they are, right? And how some of his pranks, he never directly ties it to some of the like extreme trauma that he had. He talks about like, I was angry because I didn't have any friends. I think you maybe were also possibly angry because of your alcoholic father, but I don't know. I can't speak for you. You're the author of this book, but like your pranks get really extreme at the same time that you're reporting, these other things. And I think there's self-awareness on how he's talking about this. Like at the time, I wouldn't have connected these things, but maybe now as an adult who's processed some of this, I'm tying these two things together in time and letting you as the reader make your own judgment.
I know I struggled a little bit, and I know we're going to probably end up talking about it, throughout the discussion, but I tried very hard not to be like armchair psychologist or like armchair clinician too much. Like I really tried to in reading the book, I tried to think about what his experiences are saying, what is the environment he's describing saying, what is he saying about the experiences and how it helped him develop or hurt his development or shaped his development. And tried not to play, oh, if only this or if only that, because I really didn't want to spend too much time. I think it's important for us to do it to some extent, but spend too much time just doing that. Oh, if only there had been services or if only he'd gotten a diagnosis. I think there are some interesting points that we can sort of go over in terms of like the general scope of, how environments shape behavior and how that can be good, that can be bad. But I really didn't want to think too much like, oh, he could have had a better life. And I did find myself saying that times like, oh, if only the note, I bet he would have had so many more friends. And I don't think that was the goal of writing the book. He mentioned that he certainly wished he'd had more friends, that he wished some of the things he knew now he'd known then. But it wasn't my place to say like, well, I'm a clinician and I could tell you that you should have had these things. So I did find that being a pitfall. I fell into a lot of trying to be like, what if? And it was like, not my place. This guy had a life. He's happy with his life. He's just writing a book about, how his life went. And that's the life he had. Like, I can't go back. And if I spend too much time opining on it, I'm just going to learn the wrong lesson, which is, look at me, I can change people who aren't neurotypical, which is not what he wants and not what I want either. But it's
if anything, I tried to think about how I, as a clinician, want to avoid some of those pitfalls because like his anecdotes about like his mother and pranking her with like making his brother go missing. Well, is that attention? Is that like what if our dry 4 categories of function this doesn't, like there's more to it. There's nuance in this behavior.
I'm going to FA this memoir.
Yeah, right. But that's like what we're supposed, what would we do by the book? We would do dry functional analysis. Like there's nuance here. And like, there's like a culture within his family that has issues, but he's interacting socially with people in a way that he is finding successful and unsuccessful. And so just trying to think of like, well, how would I, if I had a client that, maybe was doing some social skills work on, how would I be like, all right, well, I want to respect your autonomy, but maybe find some like better ways to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
Have a better relationship with your mom that it doesn't involve like making her think that your brother has gone missing or walked off with some adult man.
The mom also didn't seem very concerned though. So, I mean,
yeah,
it was a different time.
It was
too.
a different time.
Mandatory
it's a baby boomer memoir.
Mandatory reporter throughout the book.
I was just going to add, and maybe we'll talk about it later, but I want to make sure I say that in his self-reflection, looking back on his life, he does talk about how, he's changed over the course of his life. And he says, I've become more social. I'm able to navigate these relationships a lot better now. But he views it as a trade-off for him, right? And he
that
says,
was sad.
well, all of us, like, you got only so many neural pathways.
I know.
And
The file
let's be
is
honest.
full.
Yeah.
they're dying off. And he's saying that he was able, and we'll talk all about the amazing and fascinating things he did in life he had, but the way that he, put his energies toward those types of activities, he said it's different for him now. He doesn't think he would be able to do that again because he's worked so hard at these other tasks. Mm-hmm. So I don't think he sees one as better than the other.
Didn't seem like it because he did say,
Right.
Now he's learned these more skills. He's able to move more fluently in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's an advantage because now he feels less lonely,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where he said that before, he was like, I had my engineer, my materials, my gadgets, but they couldn't talk back to me, right? Which is a good thing and a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but he made some amazing stuff.
I can't even imagine going back and looking at something and being like, did I make that?
Well, I do that every time I write something.
Yeah, anything. If I've never made anything, I look
Did I
back
write
on it.
this? I have no recollection.
I listen to podcast episodes. I'm like, who's this? Man, that guy sounded like he really was paying attention to the articles. I don't know what he's talking about.
Maybe that's me too. Maybe I just don't have as much awareness as y'all.
Well, don't worry, Jackie. There's hundreds and hundreds of hours you could listen to of yourself saying things.
That's true, actually.
That's right. You're a recorder for posterity, man. Anyone can now just go back and listen.
Oh, and see my evolution?
Yeah.
Let's go do a deep analysis of the skill development of
Jackie McDonald
Jackie
specifically.
McDonald.
So anyway, I think, I obviously don't want to speak for him, but I don't think that we should be thinking like, what could have changed for him, right? Because then he would have missed out on some of the amazing things that he did.
Yeah, I think it's more, what could other people in his life have done? Not even just like to help him, but just to be respectful of him, to let things go.
Sure.
I mean, I'm thinking of so many of the chapters, high school was such hell for him in so many ways because he just had so many more teachers who just seemed to hate him. Just, why are you doing that? It's so annoying. Like, they were just annoyed by him. And I wish I could say, oh man, it's been 20 years since I've seen a teacher who was like, that kid annoys me and I'm going to let everyone know it. It hasn't been. I mean, it's less than when I started my career, but like, I don't think a year goes by where you don't have that sense of like, for whatever reason, maybe no one's trying to be a bad person, but there's a rub. And as the adult, I'm wondering why they're not stepping back and saying, you know what? I don't have to let this bother me. It's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. I bet I can find something positive about this learner. It just won't happen. But it feels like that was every teacher, almost every teacher for him. Like,
it was also a different time too, right?
Yeah.
Also a different time.
I think also just gleaning like what about my current clients, thinking about this man and knowing that his perspective on autism is more genuine and real and authentic than mine ever can be.
Right.
But I'm informing decisions for someone who is autistic. Then I need like a whole catalog, sort of like what Jackie was saying at the beginning, a whole catalog of memoirs and experiences.
Yeah.
Like, this feels very similar, share an anecdote or a resource to share with parents.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I had a really scampish, troublemaking like young man, I might be like, well, let's read this. Like, let's read some content from this book to like talk about why he was doing this and what can we learn. Because I think even talking like what if or what might have happened if people in his life were different, that's not necessarily that helpful either, because they didn't and can't. But knowing what changes can I make now going forward, that is useful.
Mm-hmm. I always feel like when there's like a memoir or there's a movie about someone with a disability or someone who's, you know, neurodivergent, someone, you know, different than the quote unquote the norm, that there's a segment of people who take that media, whatever it is, in, and they sort of just get dewy-eyed and talk about the triumph, and they're like proud of the individual who wrote it. And that always leaves me feeling very gross. Like I don't like that. As like, if you have that feeling, I guess you have that feeling. But I kind of feel like if you went up
that feeling.
Yeah, if you went up to you know, John Elder Robison and said, "Oh, your book, oh, it was so inspiring. What a triumph. I can't believe you." I feel like he would not have it. I don't think he'd be rude about it.
No, he might be rude.
He might be rude about it. You said he was. I think he was pretty direct about like, that's not why I wrote that. That's not what I wanted to feel.
Frank about it, not rude about it.
Yes.
Like, if you were walking up to him, he does not have to be polite.
I appreciate you read my book. That's not what I wanted you to read from it. You should read it again. Like, that's not the point. But then I sometimes feel like I'm like, am I just being like mean or cynical?
No.
Okay, good. Then I'm right. Okay, good.
You're not right, but you're not being mean.
No, I liked it when you said I was right, Jackie.
You're right.
We'll edit that out. Just go to the right part.
Let's move on to this book.
Let's do it. Okay, so before we get into the book itself, just kind of the wrap up the intro section, I looked up a little bit more information. So for those of you who don't know what book this is, it was published in 2007. Some fun stuff.
But actually, again, I have the 2008 version.
Oh, you have the 2008 version.
So it published in 2007, republished in 2008.
Yes.
With a
we sprung for the hardcover edition.
I bought it used, man.
With a postscript to the paperback edition.
I didn't have a postscript.
That's the 2008 version.
Okay,
so
but I did. The
2008 version has a postscript.
You know what I did do? You know what I did do, though? I did look up John Elder Robison's LinkedIn page to find out more about what he's been up to. Because I know you said he came and he spoke at Regis, and I said, well, he doesn't just do like book tours, right? So since writing this, he's gone on to certainly do a lot of work for advocacy work. He was on the board of the International Society for Autism Research. He's on the advisory board for the Autism Center of Excellence at UC Davis. He's the neurodiversity scholar in residence at the College of William and Mary.
That's how he came to Regis.
That's how. That's where I figured it was. I mean, he still has his company, his auto shop.
He does?
I believe so.
Oh, good.
He also co-founded an auto program, which is a high school program for teens with challenges. It says he worked for a couple years on a board of the Department of Health and Human Services, and he's continued to write books. He's written some of his further books. He wrote a book about raising his son, raising Cubby, who he mentions at the end of the book, who is a child.
So cute. I love those anecdotes.
But he is not a child anymore. He's now an adult. He's like, an adult. Right. he's probably, I think he's probably like around your age, Alan, or a little older than you actually. Who then, also had his own challenges as an adolescent.
Alan, how old are you?
Alan doesn't have to say on the podcast how old he is if he doesn't want to.
As a side note, you can tell.
Alan, blink how many times you're old.
Blink. You're 34? Okay.
Yeah.
So just for also background, this Robison was born in 1957. Mm-hmm. This book was written in 2007, so it was written when he was 50.
And he has had life since then.
Yes, and he's still been experiencing life since then. He's now like 65.
He's got to write a sequel. Yeah. That's what we're thinking. Wait a couple more years. He also wrote about his experience where he did, it was what is it called? Switched On, which was a book about, he did some like a neurological treatment that was supposed to like help his brain and how it like, changed how he thought about things or felt about things. And then he also had a book called Be Different, which was sort of just general like statements about being an Aspergian and what that means for him and how that can be a positive thing.
And that's his term, by the way.
That's his term that he uses in the book. Yeah, I should be clear. Not everyone's going to want to use that term. That is the term he uses to refer to himself in the book. I don't know if he still uses it, though, to describe himself.
I don't know.
I read some of his posts that he's written since then, or in the past few years, or in like the late tens and the 2020, and I think he's using more of the sort of autism kind of diagnosis umbrella.
Spectrum.
Yeah, more spectrum.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, at the time the book was written, Asperger's was still a diagnosis in the DSM-4 in 2013. The DSM-5 came out, which no one is now receiving an Asperger's diagnosis anymore. It's all just underneath the umbrella of autism. But folks who previously had that diagnosis can keep it if they want to. But most people don't call themselves Aspergian. That is his term. So just to make sure everyone's clear on that.
And it was relatively easy to find some of his recent posts on neurodiversity and on differences and the importance of differences online, and they read very much like his memoirs. He's very, very good writer. It's like very he talks about it in the book too, is one of the reasons he thinks he was great at running his garage, in that he gets to the point and he's precise and he explains things in a way that other people can understand. I think that's very true about his work in advocacy and in his other writings.
Looking at his most recent introduction for the IACC, it's I'm an autistic adult. I have autism. I embrace the neurodiversity movement. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of references to Aspergian.
Okay, thank you. So
but at the time,
so that's what was referred in the book. But we'll just use autistic to describe it, as needed in the conversation. All right. So with that out of the way, that's our intro. Let's get into a little bit more deep dive in the book. So, Alan, you already sort of mentioned the prologue of the teacher yelling at him to look me in the eye, young man. And I think that led me to sort of a discussion point that I wanted to bring up and that I was thinking about throughout the entire book is how many tiny social cues have sort of the neurotypical majority decided are so very important. And not only how many other, but why have we decided they're so important? And why are we so prickly about them? I mean, maybe that's a bigger question than this book, but there is that sense of that just doesn't feel like that big of a deal. Like, has everyone who didn't get eye contact from someone then been stabbed or robbed? I mean, have we all had that experience?
It is a common thing back in the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. That if you had to be respectful of your elders, you had to look people in the eye, right? Like that's on all the TV shows. So I think his experience is absolutely valid for at that point. And I think even if you think about teachers that have less knowledge or understanding of the neurodiversity movement, or I'm not even going to say older teachers because it's not just older teachers, but teachers that this is how you show respect, right? Not just teachers, right? Just general community members too. I think that still is common.
It's a firm handshake. Is a firm handshake still common, or is the pandemic wiped out the you need to give everyone a firm handshake?
There's handshakes are no longer a thing, right? But I have, based on my limited research around, reading memoirs and listening to autistic individuals, that eye contact is incredibly painful, right? So his experience is pretty similar to what I have read and learned about from not only.
I think it depends on the person,
yeah,
but certainly for some. And then I think eye contact is also socially quite complex because it can be used as a means of dominance by one group over another, and indications not making eye contact is indications of submission, another group over. And then for children with adults, that's this compliance piece that we're sort of seeing reflected here. So it's pretty complicated, and as we go further back in time, I think it is even more complicated and culturally specific as well, what the expectations surrounding eye contact are.
Well, that's how the book starts, and I think you already kind of described it, Alan, as just this is just one of those early memories you probably heard almost every single day. The prologue also describes the gist of what his home life is going to be like. So it would be bad enough if just that was his school and some of his social activities, but throughout the early parts of the book, his family is also falling apart. So, John Elder Robison did not have an idyllic, even if he were not autistic, would not have had an idyllic process of growing up. There was always a lot going on. I think that's some of the few times where he, in the book, he'll sort of mention just how much is going on, where, I get the sense even writing it, he's still overwhelmed by it. And I think he's made up with his family. I mean, the epilogue is all about making, last moments with his father. So this is all kind of old news to him. He's sort of, moved on as much as anyone sort of moves on from family trauma and youth trauma. But describing some of these situations, with his father always being drunk, with his mother increasingly struggling with mental health, but eventually getting involved with he's not a cult leader. I didn't read Running with Scissors, so I don't know, but it was like a psychiatrist who he actually had some positive memories. It wasn't the first people who's actually, cared about his interests or cared about what he wanted to say.
It doesn't matter what that guy, he eventually turned out not to be.
He was kind of his own brand of.
He wasn't like
not good.
A good character in the Running with Scissors book, right? But we're not here to talk about him.
No. Well, he makes an appearance. Not in the prologue, but he does make an appearance. And then he really, makes it very clear about his diagnosis, that this is his life story, that so much of it was colored by the fact he was not diagnosed. And even if, he was probably never going to be diagnosed because he was always very intelligent. He didn't meet, if anyone out there listened to our Neurotribes book club, he didn't meet what would be considered the definition of autism or what would be considered autism back in the 50s and 60s. So it was sort of a foregone conclusion almost that he was not going to get diagnosed, and instead got, thrown around lots of terms like he's lazy, he's angry, he's sullen, he's weird, he's awkward, like those are diagnoses for like that, describes an individual. But those are still terms that are used. And that kind of gets us off into the beginning of his preschool life,
right?
And
but
his
we
social skills.
And I think when you talk about we as behavior analysts, right? So we need to, when we read this prologue, we have to make sure that we aren't making those presumptions of our clients, right? So like, oh, they're not doing this work because they just don't want to. They're being a poop. Like even just saying it, even though you might not have the full intentions of it, puts a label on the child, right? So
for sure.
When you are talking about a child in any sort of a non-positive light, you are automatically making assertions that will then negatively impact how you work with that child in the future, right?
And it also means it's them failing you.
Yes, and not you failing them. Right, absolutely. So as a practitioner, right, and for like if you do like a take-home ABA message for that prologue, right, it is never talk about your students in a way that is negative, could be perceived as negative by anyone outside, right? How would you feel if you like walked into a room and somebody had said your kid was lazy, right? Even if your kid is lazy, you can say that as the parent, right? But nobody else.
Well, you also probably shouldn't say that as the parent.
No, I agree too, right? But I know I agree too, right? You shouldn't be saying it. But I think I've seen this more than I would like to during consulting, right? In my own practice, when I just hear things like when people are just like, "How was your day?" "Oh, it was really rough. Like this kid did this and this kid did this." Not necessary. Every time you label a child as difficult, you are going to perceive them as difficult the next time you work with them.
Or even just rephrase it. I had a difficult day. I was very frustrated with. I just, for some reason, it annoyed me because you can have those feelings. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the idea of when you're like, this kid annoyed me, then you're putting that onus of they did these, like, what's the function of behavior? Oh, well, to make me mad, to like get a rise out of me, which, I mean, again, maybe attention is the function of behavior, but that's very different than saying this child's trying to annoy me.
Like I ran out of energy because several of my clients had more needs today than I could fulfill, or just anything. Like I had the deficit today.
Right. Yeah, it's not them, it's you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think for most of us, when we have a day where we think like we want to sort of internally like, oh, my client was driving me nuts. take a step back, because it wasn't that they were driving you nuts. It's that you are probably frustrated because you could not affect the change you thought should happen. So A, is it really the change that should happen? It's probably, question one. And then B, if it's an agreed upon change that you want to have happen, take a breath and say, all right, well, that didn't work today. Here's how I will be supportive tomorrow. Here's what I think I can do to be helpful tomorrow. It's not somebody's annoying you. But yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point I think everyone has made, just in terms of that, blame, that blame and that categorization that goes into working with children with any sort of a challenge. It's how easy it is to sort of, the blame is on them. We're going to categorize them as this type of, aversive stimulus for us. And that's just no way to go about supporting anybody.
Well, it's not supporting anybody, right? Opposite.
That's why it's no way to go about supporting anybody, because it doesn't do it.
So that was my take home on the prologue. Like, I have like an ABA take home that I thought about.
That's good. I did this. I put it in bold letters. I was like, here's the thought experiment. Here's the question you should ask yourself as a practitioner. All right. So John's life, he starts off with preschool sandbox reminiscences. Which I think, Alan, you brought it up kind of in the introduction section of this is what I remember. Like, I don't know if this is actually what happened, but I think it did, because that's what I remember. Because I don't think I could describe a single thing from before my 20s, probably at this point, that has this level of detail and sort of that social autopsy component of what did I think went wrong in these early preschool interactions. Very impressive.
Or even better, like, he just knows that these are the kinds of things he struggled with when he was younger, and he has, through narrative, given us examples, and they may be based on stories that he was told. I mean, that we talk about that a lot too. But yeah, no, like and I like how very clearly human first he himself is in this. Like, I just wanted her to be my friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I made mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
But also other people didn't help me see the error.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I liked that level of accountability that he had throughout.
And Diane and I were talking about this earlier, that we like that he makes, I don't know if it's in the first chapter, but he makes the point that he always wanted friends.
Right.
It comes up a lot. I think there's a chapter near the end that's very eloquent in terms of like how that feeling is described.
He always wanted friends. It wasn't that he didn't want friends. He was lonely. It's not that he wanted to be by himself, but he didn't know how to do it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And when he did do it, people weren't nice.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something as clinicians that we can do a take home. Like, our clients want to be connected. Right? They might not want to be connected the way we want them to be connected, but they want to be connected. And it's our job to find a way for them to feel connected in a way that's safe and right for them.
Mm-hmm. To quote the passage, it's great. At the end of recess, I was still there sitting by myself, staring into the dirt, too humiliated to face the other kids. Why don't they like me? What's wrong with me? That was where Miss Laird, the preschool teacher, found me. It's time to go back inside. She grabbed my little paw and towed me in. I wanted to open a ball and disappear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
And it's such like a small, like a small moment, probably, as far as the adult is concerned. It's like, oh, there's John and there's another girl, and they're playing in the, in the sandbox, and oh no, all I noticed was that John hit her. And there was no sense of like what happened. There was no sense of trying to sort of understand, is this a pattern? There's no sense of how could I sort of, repair this? It was just, oh, you can't hit. And then you're in trouble for that. And again, his description being that I wanted my playmate to play the way I wanted to. This was the way, he considered the right way to play at that age. This is how you use the blocks. And the fact that, my partner's not doing it, that's wrong, and I want to show them how to do it. But he's a child, and again, how much of that was going through? Were his thoughts back then? It's hard to say. Versus just reflection later on. But just that sort of idea of, well, there was always a function, there was always something that could have gone differently. There was always a reason, but adults weren't taking the time, and many times still to this day don't take the time to try to figure out what is that reason, rather than just like, well, that kid's mean, or that kid doesn't get it, or that kid doesn't play nice. They don't share.
When it just goes back to the like how many experiences like this does someone who has autism or ADHD, how many failures do they have initiation? Do they have to have before they stop? It's oh, little John prefers to play by himself. It's like, does he though?
Did he tell you that? Or? Yeah.
Like, because I see him trying to interact with kids all the time. He just hasn't had a lot of success. But I mean, again, I there were several moments in this where, and I haven't mentioned this yet, that I was like, boy, like I've had this conversation with my mental health professionals, and I'm not on the autism spectrum, but in that way that ADHD and people with ADHD and people with autism talk about being neurodivergent, I saw a lot of this different functions, similar topology of I didn't understand as a kid what drove other kids because my mind didn't work the way that theirs did. I didn't have the same reinforcers, or I didn't know what cues to pick up on. So he does a really good job of giving some like very clear, simple examples of that in this these early chapters.
Yeah. I think moving into the next chapter, I was really surprised at how much of his social development kind of read like a lot of the more kind of cognitive behavioral social skills manual, in terms of, I noticed what other people did. I made rules of sort of like what I could do, or I recognized some steps I could take so that people would accept me, because, he talks about his family moved, and he sort of recognized if I talk about something that they're not talking about, people think that's weird. So I need to take this step and then that step. And then that way I had friends. And he was actually able to make, I didn't get the sense that they were, best friends or anything, but he was able to find playmates a little bit later on. So it wasn't, like his entire life, there was no one he could ever talk to, or he had no interactions with anybody. But so much of that process, he just had to figure out on his own. And even into adulthood was sort of making those kind of logic leaps of, I noticed that when I do this, people seem to make an uncomfortable face. Or when I say this, even though I thought that was the right thing based on the context of the conversation, I guess it wasn't. So I have to now think more about like, why wouldn't that be the right thing to say? And just this, it's like a constant sounding very exhausting set of steps that he has to take for these interactions that, the neurotypical of us just sort of, we're just going to just talk. I just get it. I get the cues. No one ever taught me these things. I just figured them out through, very little learning that I had to do. But, he talks about responding with interest to make friends, recognizing which responses got an annoyed response from other people, not doing those as much. And a little bit of frustration in that he felt that a lot of the adults, we think about adults as supporting, and I'm sure they thought they were, and that they would talk to him and have these long conversations with him because he was very bright. He's very, very smart. And how so much of that messed him up, because that's not how kids talk. Kids aren't going to tolerate your tangent or your laser focus on one area of interest. They're going to get bored. And he learned most of it through most of his conversation skills through talking with adults who just always, if he had something to say, they kind of followed it along. They just went along with him, no matter how much it was off the topic that the adults were having, how they weren't paying attention. They didn't really pay attention or do much with the body language he was giving them. And how he feel like that really hamstrung his abilities as a child. I suppose
what his line is, what 11-year-old wants to be called professor.
Yeah. Yeah.
He had a line like that. It was really good.
Yeah. But again, he, even with all that work that he was putting into it, even, I hear that and I say, wow, that's great. Like that's such a level of understanding is not the wrong word, but it's such a level of attentiveness and reflection. But he still thinks, even able to make some friends, he had a sense that he was inferior. He was still just inferior to everybody. His friends, his friends weren't as good as some of the other friends. Some of his friends were younger kids. Adults were still giving him a hard time. As much as he was able to talk with adults, he still had a hard time with the adults at school. And that just never seemed to change. So even though I think there were a lot of successes in this chapter, and I think there are a lot of successes in most chapters, that sense of sadness from him just never goes away, that he's inferior, that he can't do it. I don't know how much of it was just he decided that, or how much of it that was what he heard every single day from his teachers or from kids or from family members, that you're different, you're not good.
And when he talks about it a little later, he has a moment where he sort of pivots and is like, there's a lot of room at the bottom and I'm not even at rock bottom, but there's plenty of us down here and I'm happy to be here.
Well, I know like later he got into a group for troubled teens, I think it was the group. And I think, I don't remember too much about what he talked about. It was so nice to know that there were a lot of kids out there who had a lot of problems. And yeah, I wasn't the only one, and nor was I the one with the biggest problems.
Right.
But again, when the high point is, it's nice to know I'm not, quote unquote, the most screwed up of the kid. That's still, you don't want anyone to feel that way. And it's so unfortunate. The next chapter on empathy, I think you'd mentioned this a little bit, Jackie, but this, actually, no, Jackie, this was the chapter you were referring to. And this is one of those chapters where he sort of just takes a step back and talks about his perception of what some of these skills mean to him as an autistic individual, and potentially to other individuals. But this is the one you mentioned kind of in the intro section, Jackie, about how so many of what we think of as an empathetic response rings kind of hollow, because people, I'm so sad about that terrible crisis somewhere else, and the fact that he's not bawling is a sign that he's not empathetic, whereas his thought process is, well, I don't know that person. I've learned that, it's a good thing to say, like, oh, that's terrible. And, I do think it is terrible. However, they do not affect my life directly. And that doesn't feel fair to consider it empathy, that you're like, I'm crying about somebody I never know and their sad event. And I think that's true to some extent, too. I mean, I subscribe to the same school of when people start bawling about events that have happened that have just absolutely no effect whatsoever on them. I feel like it's the most, I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions on other people and what they're thinking, but it just comes off as so disingenuous to me.
I think it depends on the person.
Yeah.
Right. Because some people will then be sad because they'll think about maybe not that person dying, but someone close to them dying, right? So it might not be the person.
Everyone's probably got a process that they're going through that is impossible for any other person to say, oh, this annoys me, because same idea. It's like, for me, I wouldn't feel that way. It's where I should leave it.
And he has a nice ultimate conclusion of it's a learned behavior, and one that he did not learn easily when it came to people beyond his immediate circle, which is fair. Like, I think it's a great example of, I think that's an expectation that mainstream society has that we should definitely re-examine, because he's right. It's like, you can say something sad, but it doesn't mean it should, like, especially when he's like 6, like, rip his like guts out. So
that example he gives to start off the chapter is his mother talking with another mother about somebody who got hit by a train. The child got hit by a train, and his response was to laugh, and he gets in trouble for that response.
And his response to internal events is to laugh.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good point out. His response to his internal events. He then describes that, what he heard is it wasn't an issue of like, I'm laughing because somebody died, I must be evil. It was a lack of understanding of the parents as to what his private events were, because he laughed because he read this as, oh, these are steps of things that would never happen to me, and it was a relief. I'm glad that I don't think that would happen to me, so I don't think this is related to me right now. And he was a child. But again, it was perceived as, well, you're not supposed, like who wrote that rule? If something sad happens and somebody laughs, like, oh, that's a sign of the devil, ooh, that's got to be something bad. Like, who decided that? I know most of us probably don't respond that way, but again, you can't read someone else's mind. You're not sure what the private events that control that behavior are. So maybe just give it a sec. Breathe. Who cares? It doesn't affect you. But this definitely, I think, is a pattern that, I know some of the patterns of sort of negative behavior from adults we saw, like, those are the 50s and 60s. I don't think this one is. This one, I think, if many people, if you sort of laughed or had a non-expected response to sad news, it would be, well, what's wrong with you? Rather than, oh, you're dealing with something in a different way, or you're dealing with this information, this cue.
It's not their fault though. It's the community's fault.
It's community's damn community.
It's how our culture is formed. That shouldn't be.
Yeah. The next chapter, he talks about his pranks. I did not take a lot of notes on the chapters about pranks. I found them to be hilarious anecdotes, especially the ones he did on the cops. But you know, and some of the ones he did on the teachers, he did not like. But I think, Alan, you summed it up the best. I think the big take home for a lot of us on this chapter is he engaged in these pranks because on so many people who had really done a lot of things, done wrong by him in a lot of ways, especially the teachers who he kept sending, that I think it was a science teacher, he kept sending things to his house.
A reversible doll
yeah.
for extracurricular activities, and then the gravel. And I'm like, the teacher deserved it. Go, John. Like,
the teacher did deserve it.
Yeah.
The gravel, though, man, I was like, I hope I am never a teacher that gets gravel, because that is so much work.
Yeah, the reversible doll is just like, well, I guess I got that now. I'll put it in the closet. But like gravel, it's like, well, that's you gotta rent like a bulldozer.
And I just wonder how like transparent he was that the teacher knew to come up to him and be like, so what do you know about Ursula?
Yeah.
I don't, like, did we forget our name on the order form? Like, what? How did the teacher know? Or had he just pranked the teacher specifically so much, and they had gotten like the teacher had never changed, and so things got worse for the teacher because he continued to be a jerk.
Yeah.
I suppose, if I were in that teacher's shoes and a kid had pranked me, I'd probably be very angry, because it's that sense of like, oh, this young person is getting one up on me, and that's making me think that I'm getting old or I don't understand.
But you are.
Well, which is true. But it also, could you step out of that emotion for a moment, or that emotional responding for a moment, and say, you know what, for this kid who I think is weird and is failing and isn't doing any of the work, to come up with this complex scheme and clearly have had the wherewithal to like get into places that he wasn't supposed to be, to purchase, the magazine he needed to do, like, maybe I should really give this kid more credit than I'm giving. And of course, that's not what happened. Yeah. Maybe if this were like a Hallmark movie, that might have been the end of the chapter, but no, it was not. But again, that sense of, how teachers can just get so angry when kids don't do the same thing, which I then did try to step back. I did in my notes. I'm not doing it necessarily right now, to say, you know what, why might teachers do that? What is the function of the behavior? And again, teachers are also put upon of like, here's 30 kids. You need to make sure all of them hit all the benchmarks.
No. We don't have to have any kind of empathy for this guy. Like, he's a jerk.
Well, no. I'm not having empathy for the teacher. Okay. That guy's dead. Who cares? Yeah. I don't care about him. But in general, when we're for us as clinicians, when we're working with teachers and we're noticing this pattern, this antagonism coming through, it behooves us to certainly to support the student, to support who's probably our client. But if we don't want to fall into the trap of like, yeah, that teacher's a real jerk, because we can't change the teacher's behavior if we go up to them like, you know what our problem is? You are a jerk. The teacher's probably being a jerk for a number of reasons, one of which might be
training.
I've training. I don't know how to work with kids with disabilities as well as I should. I know it and it makes me feel bad, but rather than, I can't take a course because I don't have enough money, or I have some personal problem, I have to teach 30 kids. I got 7 of them who are just like, feel like they don't want to learn, and I don't know how to help them, and I've tried and I'm burned out and I'm tired. So there's always a lot that has to be taken into account. So again, science teacher who got the reversible doll, the gravel, yeah, nuts that guy. He's dead anyway. So we can't change that behavior. It happened. But in the future, thinking about all of the players and thinking about all of the variables, and some of them that we can affect, some of them that we can't affect. And at the end of the day, it's the child we have to support. But we do have to pay attention to the fact that the teachers are engaging this behavior for a reason. Yeah. And it's not the child, but it's other variables.
Who doesn't like there comes a point where I don't have to treat them uncivilly, but their uncivil behavior has to end and be their responsibility, not mine.
Alan, you make a good point. And I'm certainly agreeing in the sense that I have reached my limit. I love that the ethics code has it in there. It's not a matter of you are ethically required to overcome every barrier. You are only ethically required to note the barriers and write down the steps to overcome the barriers.
Right.
And perhaps no one wants to overcome those barriers. So maybe you do want to yell at someone a little bit. Maybe your 4-letter words might pop out in a meeting. Not the greatest step, but hey, I wrote my barriers and I can't affect all the change in the world, folks. So I'm back to my client. I'm in the client's corner, the child's corner. You're right, because they are adults. And while I think it's important for us to be sensitive to those variables, we are also not required to fix them, nor can we fix them. And we are not required to make adults be adults. But yes, those are some good pranks. More to come, but I don't know if we'll talk about them as much. The next chapter, he finds a Porsche, and in my notes, I wrote mostly a chapter of memories of finding a Porsche, riding a Porsche, fixing a Porsche, and loving Porsches.
And informs later chapters about like why he loves Porsches so much. Like, again, good narrative structure that he has going on.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. And again, John Elder Robison did not write this book in 2007/2008 so that it could be featured on a behavior analytic book club. So,
he did not.
we have a view we have to take. So some chapters didn't get as much attention in our discussion here. The next chapter, I mean, as much as it sounds like, wow, things have really been tough for John, the next chapter gets even worse in terms of his childhood because so many of his home life challenges start coming into place, in which his mother starts engaging in delusions. His father continues to drink. He becomes abusive to John. This is where he meets the character played by Brian Cox, Dr. Finch, in the movie version. I almost said this is where he meets Brian Cox, but that would have been a positive activity. He meets the character, the actual person then played by Brian Cox, Dr. Finch, who again is something of a quack, dangerous quack. But the first memory that John has is he's the first person to actually ask John, what do you think about that? Or how would you like this to go? So, even though this person, and he clearly knows, like, this person was a terrible influence on my family, was a terrible influence on my young brother and my mother, and was probably was a horrible person, it sounds like.
But we don't know.
We don't know, but that's
came to be increasingly problematic.
Okay,
yes.
That's the phrasing.
But in this chapter, don't get me wrong, like, you can call your parents whatever you want. Oh, like slave and stupid. Like,
yeah.
Okay, like, we're advocating that he gets to call his parents this. Like, well, someone's advocating for him. I can't say I would do it quite that way, but
what a strong memory. That someone advocating for him. It's sort of like, I'm sure we all have that friend, and then we have that other person that everybody in our social group hates. But for some reason, one time he did something so nice to our friend that no matter much how our friend is like, no, I know that this person's like a bigot and is cruel to animals and commits crime, but he did that one time. That's kind of how that chapter reads. Of I know this guy had all these legal troubles and like kind of kidnapped my mother at some point. But he, that one time he did advocate for me. So, but just for that to be such a powerful memory and connection, even knowing everything that came later, that it still reads like, I think overall there's like a net positive. Like, his opinion is kind of a net positive on the, not really, but in that sense of, he still kind of thinks fondly of that one time that someone listened to him. But I think that more speaks to just how few people in the rest of his life were listening to him, that would be such a salient, positive memory. Hey, everyone. Just want to pause real quick to make sure you hear the first of our secret code words for listening to this, especially if you're listening to this on our Patreon feed, then you are able to access free code words. Just go to the post on the website, put in the 2 secret code words, and you will get 2 CEs for free for listening. And as a big thank you for being a Patreon supporter. If you're hearing this off in the far future when this episode has finally been unlocked, then you can just use these code words, but you will have to go to the website and you will pay the small CE processing fee for the 2 CEs. So whichever one you are, this will work for both of you. The first keyword is ACE, ACE, whether you're an ACE pilot or an ACET darts, I don't know, or Ace Frehley, guitarist of Kiss, who loves John Elder Robison's awesome smoking and missile shooting guitars. That's the code word you're going to want. Ace.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Things start picking up from here, though. We get into Chapter 7, Assembly Required, and this is where John starts learning about electronics, and this is going to be so much of what allows him to have a very exciting teens and 20s in terms of all the experiences he gets to have.
Way more exciting than my teens and 20s.
Well, I mean, except for the time that you went on tour with Kiss as well, so.
I just, the intro paragraph to this chapter, it's almost like this was burned in the memory of everyone's understanding of autism and what Asperger's diagnosis was associated with culturally. Until my 13th Christmas, I studied rocks and minerals, dinosaurs, the planets, ships, tanks, bulldozers, and airplanes. That Christmas, I got something new, an electronics kit. It's like, did this guy, like this memoir inform everybody's understanding of like what autism was?
One of my favorite lines. He's like, doesn't everyone's dad take him to the train depot? And I was like, I've actually never been to a train depot.
It sounded unfun to me. I'm glad they had a good time, but I didn't want to go to the train depot.
But right,
after
like
that.
I was like, oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this does lead to, I think, some of the chapters that I found very informative in terms of his describing his interests and his laser focus, and how, and I think Diana had brought it up kind of earlier in the discussion, how, so many people then take that to be like, you must be a savant, which I think is such a kind of become this real loaded term, and how he never saw himself as a savant. He saw himself as a very smart person who was very, very focused on learning about, specifically in this case, electronics. And it's not that anyone could have done it.
And was given opportunities to do it. And he's very, I think it's also important though, because it informs later on his talking about forgiving his family and his relationship with his father. Like, this is a time when my father was a good person to me. For a very narrow little bit. Like, he helped me with electronics, and that became important to me. I just think that's important to remember that, that this is also informed by, his interest is informed by the fact this was something that my father built me a workshop for in the basement because it happened to be in the afternoon. And luckily he wasn't drunk when these things happened, and it didn't ruin my love of electronics. It enhanced it. And just that conversation in his memory of there's redeemable qualities sometimes in these awful people. So
because they're people, right? They've made bad choices. But they're still people.
Yeah, exactly.
And they have made good choices too, which I really love that he added that part about the dad, right? He's like, here are all the, tell me good things. And his dad was like, here are some good things. And he's like, that's amazing. But we got ahead of ourselves, but I think we just solidified that chapter.
If anyone's like, I don't want to read a book and see this I'd like to see this relationship on, say, an HBO Max TV show. If you have not watched Peacemaker, there's some complex father-son dynamics on that show in which, this father is a complicated individual. The father on Peacemaker is a real evil bastard. But the idea of families and relationships and how often we will let things slide for the people that we want to love us and care about us. That is a good example. You should read both, though. Read the book, and then you go watch Peacemaker afterwards too. Just a shout out. HBO Max is not paying us anything for that shout out. I just wanted to bring it up.
Not a sponsor.
John Cena did not give me any money to say that. I just appreciate the show. But this is where he really is describing, I think, again, Alan, like you were talking about, the kind of example of like, what everyone thinks of autism. It does go into the idea of, I didn't know some of the math involved in the electronics, but I could visualize, I could hear the sounds, and I could visualize what would need to happen with the electronics to make certain sounds occur with the amplifiers he was building. And that really led him to becoming part of the music scene in Shutesbury, where he lived, and Amherst nearby. So he kind of became a mainstay of some of the clubs and bars because he just could build awesome electronics. And he started building things at school as well. He fixed all the tape players and the old audiovisual equipment of the 60s. Which,
and
again,
he formed relationships. He formed relationships around these things. Like, that's an important thing that I really want to point out. That like these were people that he like had relationships with. And he talks about like Mary Lee being a like young woman that like liked Robert Heinlein, and they would take walks, and like and he even kind of like wistful about like maybe there was some romantic possibility there, but that was what dating was for like us in the world of autism in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And again, one of those like moments of like, oh, like because he thinks about it in this like what might have been. Just for a moment, it makes me think of like, oh, like what were the possibilities? Like, how could we change and make that relationship better if he were seeking help now?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing.
I mean, a lot of these chapters, maybe it's just because that's where I spend, my day job, just brought me back to the teachers. If you have this student who is fixing all the audio visual equipment, yet is failing all of your classes, it boggles the mind that someone didn't say, oh, maybe he's not as interested in the stuff that we're teaching. Maybe,
but that wasn't the 70s.
But it's still
right.
Now, though. Like, nobody, like, I think more people are willing to talk about the idea of like, man, why are we teaching all this early 20th century farmer school crap these days? And we have more technology. But at the end of the day, you're not doing well at the class we're forcing you to take, even though you're amazing at some other thing.
At the end of the day, teachers are overworked, overwhelmed, and underpaid.
But it's not the teacher responsibility. It's more of a
societal
school structure.
Still, though, right? Like, everyone at this point is overworked, where we don't have the supports to provide students with that.
Well, nobody tells me, you know what, Rob, you seem overworked. I guess you can stop. They keep giving me more crap to do. So I'm going to give it back. What do you think about that, society?
I think that's
I'm
what's
going to put a mirror up to you, society.
But I think that's
Look
what's
at that.
happening.
But that's always happened. This happened before the pandemic.
No,
it's not like,
true.
man, education sure was humming along and really taking advantage of the interests of students and focusing on
Right, but
what
that's
they
your
wanted
job.
to do pre-pandemic.
This is
my
your job
Yeah.
now to change that system.
I'm doing it right now. I'm speaking truth to power.
Okay.
Well, and I don't mean to get hit, but that's a great way that he opens up like the chapter 9 with the line of like, or at one point he's like, well, I have all F's at this point, so finally I can just call it quits. And
Right.
like the school even gives me a way out.
Yeah.
Thank
Goodness.
right? Like,
thank
woo,
goodness.
big
I
sigh
love
of
that when they're like,
relief.
fine, take the GED. Again, I sort of wish he'd met. I mean, I think all his teachers were dead by the time he's an adult and moves back to, his sort of hometown. But I would have loved, and then maybe this is like the movie script version of the book, to meet an old teacher and be like, I wish I'd appreciated everything you do. Like, had that moment, that cathartic moment, like, I should have appreciated, because clearly you knew all the material, you just weren't doing well in the class, possibly because you hated me because I was so mean to you all the time. That's probably the main issue there. But it's just I don't know. It just, that part just frustrated. Like, I felt backseat frustrated
You
for,
probably
for
felt
John.
vaccine frustrated too because you're in the school,
I am, yes.
right? So this is your personal history.
I see this all the time.
Getting into the way of reading the book.
And again, it's not something I feel like I can fix right away or even in years and years, and that makes me angry, but not at anybody else. Just it's at the system or at the structures that are in place.
Right, but just recognize that too.
I just did.
I know, I'm telling you.
I'm recorded. Everyone will hear that from now.
Okay. Moving on.
I'm growing through podcasting, Jackie. So.
I know you are. You really are. We all are.
And then at the end of my podcast movie, I'll meet my old teacher who was like, "Oh, I should have known." You want to bring it back around?
And all of my teachers, except for one of my math teachers, are still alive.
I think most of my teachers are still
one
alive.
just died.
That's sad.
And I am Facebook friends with many of them, Ellen.
So he has his high school. I guess he graduated from high school. He does not have his diploma because he did not say, "Why would I pay for the stupid diploma?" Because it was like $15 or something. I thought that was very funny.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of who cares about that. And spent the whole summer. His parents were falling apart. His brother was sort of stuck in their orbit. And he spent the whole summer hanging out with a Vietnam vet, living in the woods.
That was fascinating.
That was great.
For that take-home message, for the ABA take-home message, mine was recognize that people's experiences are different than yours and embrace them for what they are. Right? That was my take-home message for, like, how can I relate this chapter to my clients?
Mm-hmm.
Is like, yeah, your clients might have a friend in the woods that is probably having some traumatic experience that they need to work through, and that's okay. Meet them where they are, wherever they are, and walk together.
I think it turned out like I don't know.
He turned out to be like
he was like a Green Beret. He was like a fame. He went to like Senate hearings later on. So this wasn't just some like John Rambo character that he met in the woods. This was someone who was making a choice after coming back from Vietnam. Like this is what he wanted to do with his life. Which then led John to make the choice that as much as he appreciated meeting him and living in the woods at various times, that's not what he wanted. He still wanted to be near people, and that put him back into the amps, which I think speaks to the idea of the concept of what are your values and living for your values. He wanted to be with people, even though it didn't always work. It's what he wanted.
Well, and he expresses in his logical empathy, as he calls it, a healthy skepticism of a lot of these people, or at least in retrospective. Like, I wondered about that, but it was going well. And how often would it be helpful? It's like, well, that's not what I would do, but my client's doing it, not hurting them, not let's just find a way to incorporate that and make it okay in daily life. And make they have a relationship. Let's go with it.
Right? Yeah, I know.
If you're super worried, why don't you join them? And you can do it. You can go live in the woods.
Be the kind of person that John wants to have a relationship with.
Exactly.
Have such a problem with the relationship that he does have.
I don't know. And this was also the part in the memoir where I was like, I'm going to think back on my childhood. And I was like, I don't think anything this exciting happened. I didn't have any fun Vietnam vet people living in my woods. I didn't none of that.
Or
nothing.
You just weren't out there in the woods meeting them. That's.
You know what? No, we did have a crazy neighbor.
For you in the woods.
What?
They were there waiting for you
the whole time.
Yeah,
that's what they all went.
Yeah.
We did have a crazy neighbor who lived behind my mom's house, and we'd knock balls over the fence. And me and my friend, at the time, we climbed over the fence, and I distinctly remember that he came and yelled at us, and he had a gun, and he was so pissed at us for being on his yard. But it's one of those memories. I'm like, did I make that up? And then I just told that story so many times that did not happen. But there's no way for me to prove or disprove that anymore. And that guy also dead, so can't ask him, can't corroborate. So John decides he needs people. The next example of him meeting people is him telling funny stories about being a trash collector, which are not true, but because he sells the stories. They all believe these crazy stories of being a trash collector and all the
clearly really strong storytelling genes in his family. I could never make this stuff up.
His mom was a poet.
Right.
His dad was, a professor. So, I mean, it was a very, very intelligent family. They had storytelling in the genes.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and he's only telling them like what they snobbishly want to
Yes.
hear. And like that's the brilliance of it. In this anecdote, it's like, I'm going to tell them that I'm someone they wouldn't like, and then I'm going to make it intriguing, and they get to just judge and clasp their pearls because it's what they like to do. And I'm just loving how like stupid they are for believing this story about feral children and trying, like it's.
And then he's got to leave because there's a trash emergency.
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah,
love
they're
that.
fire and like how trash collectors are sort of running a like crime syndicate of
Yeah.
we're not picking up your trash, and so you're getting closed down. So you might want to tip us, right? Like it's just
I
hilarious.
love the woman's like, that woman's totally me. Am I supposed to tip my trash collector? That's totally me. I'd be like, crap, I gotta get home.
He's like, I'll take the money too.
Yeah, right. That would totally be me. I've fallen for tricks like that in the past.
Oh boy. The anecdotes continue right into the next chapter, and his friend Jim, who is a machinist who has a little garage shop, and they make it's like a big bathtub where they can do all sorts of machine work, and they can put acid in it, and they can fix parts and
This
stuff.
chapter was upsetting to me.
Why was this upset?
I think because I'm a parent.
Oh,
And I was like, oh no, they should not be doing this. This is very, very dangerous.
Do you know what's funny?
Yeah.
When I read this chapter, I was like, Diana is not gonna like this
but
chapter.
who were the most unsafe people in that chapter? It was the people of authority. When the firemen came,
No one was being safe in this. They worked out that they did not have a major accident.
but they handled the accident as well as they could. They took the fire, they took the bathtub that was in flames away from all the flammable material. It was going to let itself out because the Jim understood how the fire was set. He knew what he'd done wrong.
Yeah.
He knew what the problem was. He told the firemen,
Yes.
there's magnesium in there. Don't throw water on that. Because
Right,
if you
they
ever
were- the
remember your
firemen were
chemistry,
stupid.
folks, if you put water on magnesium, it blows the hell up. So of course that's what happened to the bathtub.
Well, especially because it was magnesium and gasoline. So you're
Yeah, it was a lot of stuff.
It was very unsafe. I understand he had like I don't know, adulterated childhood, right? Like,
Well, they were like 16, 17 at this point. So they were almost adult. I think Jim was an adult.
Yeah.
like at this point he's got his GED, right? So
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
like
He's living in
I
the
just-
woods, he can.
I don't know. I still felt protective of them.
I can imagine you did. I
And-
literally read that and I was like, Diana is not going to be that mom that's just watching while finishing her cigarette on the side.
No, it's important to let kids experiment, but there has some really unsafe chemicals here.
well,
like
and
that's what you
I
people
I
do.
also like that like Jim's parents come out and like have a cigar
Yeah.
and whatever, and
Yeah.
they just look at the fire and they're like, whatever, and just go back inside.
Mhm.
And Jim's like, why did you call the police? Or why did you call the firemen? They're just gonna like knowing that they're just gonna mess it up. And
Yeah.
what do? They
Mess it up.
Mess it up.
See, I kind of want to hear about Jim's life. Did he have
He seemed very
did he have an
interesting.
exceptionally, I would say better life, but in terms of like a better childhood or more positive childhood, because his parents apparently were very understanding of whatever his eccentricities were. It's never mentioned that Jim is autistic or that Jim has a disability. He just seems like he's kind of a character.
And it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't. It
doesn't
doesn't
matter.
matter. But for whatever reason, his parents seem to just accept like that. This is what he does. He just loves to
Or
make
they
this
don't
stuff.
care.
Or they don't care.
We don't know, but that's besides the point, right? It's besides
They
the
didn't
point.
throw him
about
out, man. Like a lot of parents would have thrown their kid out if it's like, you set the garage on fire. I'm going to lose my job because it was like university housing too.
Right. Or at this point, they'd be like, oh, Jim's got this under control.
Yeah.
We don't know.
But that shows a
Jim's
level of
had
respect for their
enough
child.
fires, and Jim puts them out. So why should I care?
Mhm.
Like, again, I'm not saying it's good, but there's a lot of like neutral gray interpretations
Yeah.
of this.
Possibly.
Ultimately, it is frightening, as Diana says, to think that like we've just got a tub full of our like chemical waste.
Yep.
And I don't know
Just
about
in the neighbors.
about you or the listeners, but I watch a lot of like YouTubers that do like home chemistry stuff, and I
Oh.
just
That's
thought
too scary.
about like
Oh God.
like it's so like these are my disposal bags, and this is like I do it, and like in a couple of years when I have all this waste that I need to get rid of, I'm going to have to call the proper people, and I'm just like, these people are just Jim in the modern era. It's like, we all had like proper chemical safety classes. And so
if Jim could have streamed, he would have had such a lucrative career. But the fact he missed it. He missed the time.
Like these people still exist. They just have YouTube channels now.
Well, I think that also points out one of the things that I loved about the book is just the whole arc of just the history of everything and how so many of the behaviors that in the book are like, this is crazy, or like, I can't believe it. And now it's like, no, someone made $1 million doing that. Yeah, of course. That's totally normal behavior now because just, mores have changed or expectations have changed or technology has changed, which I think is hard to do because you think about, some of our clients are like, I wish they could do this. If only they could do this because they only have this interest. Like you don't know that interest isn't going to be the best interest ever that makes them a millionaire 10 years from now. Like you don't know that. Like, go back to the Far Side comic where the joke is, my kid's going to make $1 million playing Nintendo someday. It's like, Gary Larson, people did make $1 million playing Nintendo. Like, that's a legitimate career you could have now. But the joke is supposed to be, what a stupid career. You can't have that. Because times change. Anyway.
This would have been like the late 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could tell it's late 70s.
It feels like the late 70s just from the atmosphere.
The next adventures are all about being I'm in prison with the band.
So I think we take the band the band chapters.
Truckin'.
Jackie, tell me about your feelings on Foghat. What do you think? Let's really get deep into it.
My friends have a low round.
Okay, so as when I'm reading these chapters, the band chapters, right? There's many band chapters.
Yeah,
there are. There are a lot of band chapters.
There's a lot of band chapters. So I would like to not talk about each of them individually because I think it's not.
Because you want to talk about each member of KISS individually.
No, because I don't.
Ace Frehley, Gene Simmons.
It doesn't lend itself to our
Peter Criss.
This doesn't lend itself to our discussion of what practitioners should do or what we as behavior analytic providers should glean from it. But I think what we can say is that it does make a very nice way. When you're reading the book, it provides experience, right? It's a memoir, right? Mm-hmm. And it provides an experience of an individual's life and how they interact with the world, right? But I don't think as a practitioner, we're going to be able to say a lot more about it, right? Like we can't say, like, let's talk about the smoking guitar for like 20 minutes, right? Like,
did you really think I was going to talk about the smoking guitar?
Yeah, I did.
There has been, is, and will continue to be a lot of social context that if we would embrace, accept, and allow for differences and disabilities to be accommodated, society is so much better.
Yes.
Because
taking it home, we got it.
Yeah, we have people like John doing all the electrical equipment for like people like KISS, and so many people's lives are probably better because of their love of music. And so John gets like to be part of that. And there's probably was able to do things we weren't able to do, people that weren't like John at the time. So boom. Those 5 chapters done. Let's go.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I different. It's not specifically about 70s rock bands, folks. Come on, you think so little of my book club
I have a lot
discussions.
to say about 70s rock bands.
Okay. But it's not. Is it relevant to ABA?
We're gonna do a bonus episode.
I didn't say I was going to talk about it.
No.
I bonus episode then, right?
But what I did.
You've never gotten the lead out. Go ahead.
What I did take from this section of the book, in which just kind of generally he's with a local band, he's with KISS, he has all these great adventures, creating these amazing electronic guitars and all these cool special effects, is how even with the level of acceptance that he had, even with sort of this motley crew that he was surrounded with.
Wait a minute.
Not the band Motley Crue. I don't know who's in Motley Crue. I can't so it's Dr. Feelgood.
Stop it.
But even with this group, he still always felt a little outside of the group. And that, how that just shaped some of the experiences, does he ever think back and say, I miss some of these experiences that I could have had because I didn't, feel quote unquote normal in them. I also did think these chapters also really captured the idea of wow, that's the savant idea. And there was a quote he has of which, everyone was talking about how he could design these things and fix the amps. How like amazing it was magic. He thought it was a natural gift, but it was really something I'd worked very hard at for several years. And how I think sometimes we see people who can do these amazing things, especially if they have disabilities, like, wow, they could do this thing. That must be like their special talent, rather than like, no, it's something that they spend time on and they work at, just like you or I would work at like a hobby that we get really, really good at. And it's just so like rude and insulting to just assume if you have a disability and you're good at something, it must be because it's your magic savant power, rather than, no, it's something that you are intensely focused on and you practice and you engage with. Just because that's how learning works. It's not like a magical gift.
It's because jerks like you didn't give me other opportunities, and I found them within the world of electronic engineering.
Exactly. All right. So
I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
I also think that one can be, inclined toward having a certain type of skill in an area. And then with opportunity, that could more easily develop into, the 1% skill. And that may have different, chances of occurring based on your own genetic background. So I feel like it's hard to self-reflect on, am I a savant in this area, or did I work really hard, right? Because if it's something that you're going to be good at, then you're going to enjoy spending time at it, and then you're going to spend more and more time at it anyway. So I think it's a chicken and egg thing to some degree.
Goes back to his talking about how he could visualize, he could connect his like love of music and sound, and being like frustrated that he like, what do you mean a wave? Well, how does this like calculus formula for the wave equation equate? Like, what does that have to do with acoustic guitars? But then like with time and effort, he was able to like create that visual metaphor for himself of like, oh, like this transistor takes this wave and turns it into this wave. And then he could start to like plan out and do all sorts of like very advanced electronic engineering kind of stuff, advanced for someone of his age and exposure.
Right.
And excel very quickly. So again, there's, as you were saying, there's that like his neurological differences or his strengths. That is not something that other people tend to have the ability to do.
I know I can't even add like lots of numbers together, right?
Right. And yeah, and I just thought it was funny because I think about our field and all of our awful graphs and visual analysis, but like it worked for him. And whether like it would be very problematic to say, well, that was his Asperger's, right? Though that was his autism that gave him that ability. Well, no, like I don't know. Like a lot of people, like I thought about Temple Grandin and all of her visual metaphors. It's something that some people with autism report being able to do. And so like, it's an important thing to note, but it doesn't have to be savantism or nothing.
All right. So makes cool guitars. He shoots a snake. I do sort of, I did feel for him in terms of just how much anxiety he had with all of his building, materials, that he always felt like he was going to fail, sort of wondering like, oh, how much of that was because everyone always told you were a failure, you poor guy, and I started having like a pity party, which I don't think is what he wanted or was the goal, but I fell into that trap myself. And, at some point he realized that he was not making, money. He was not having a career. It was fun. Whoa, that is pretty awesome. Diana has found a picture. That is pretty cool.
Pretty
Text
great.
it to me, Diana.
Okay. Will do.
She found it in a
even
card
better
catalog,
one.
Alan. It's going to be a while. She's got to figure that out. So he decided to
cool,
go into other electronics. So he started working for which company was it?
A board game company.
Parker Brothers. It was. I wrote it down somewhere. But he started kind of working at an electronics company, which is funny because he was talking about how he helped make this old game, Dark Tower. And as I was reading that chapter, I'd recently read a news article that they just re-released like a brand new version of this Dark Tower, which was apparently this old, amazing board game with this big fancy dark tower. Now it's this like Bluetooth enabled board game that they just brought out to make, you know, Gen Xers happy.
I was like, disclaimer to the audience that if they haven't seen, right behind Rob is a wall of like neatly like organized board games, and so I can see why Rob was particularly interested in this portion of John's life.
Yes, I did not kickstart the game to get closer to the memoir though, because it was a little too expensive. But you know, he has some more great pranks. But this is sort of, I think, where he hits his next sort of wall in terms of he's great working. You know, he actually enjoys working in the office. He makes some friends in the office at the different levels. You know, he's sort of like considered a manager. But then he hits the point at which he finds his challenges with social interactions don't meet whatever the expectations of his bosses are. And he starts having trouble keeping his jobs because he's so good at his jobs that he keeps getting promoted. But he doesn't like being promoted. But of course, he keeps hearing the refrain, "You're not a team player," which I think in like 70s, 80s business speak is probably just some like coke fueled like statement that means absolutely nothing. Like I don't think it was like anywhere near where, you know, where we think of like business management is nowadays. It was just a bunch of, you know, rich jerks who were.
Well, they're still talking about
they're
still thinking in Carnegie terms.
Yes, they're still talking, I think, but we don't know, right? We can't really comment on who those business people were because they don't know.
Well, we know one of them snorted a whole bunch of Formica that he thought he was was cocaine.
Yeah. Won't be helpful.
That was a great story.
Yeah, it was.
But
yeah.
I mean,
I liked this line, which was, for the first time in my life, I put on a nice button-down shirt and tie each morning. I was even on time most of the time. Like, that never had meaning for him until like it was relevant and like part of his like success and his performance. And I think that's like, again, goes into like, is that masking? Is it like motivation to fit in? But is important. But for him, he's like, I was on time. Like, that's a big thing for me. And I'm going to like celebrate. Like, you don't understand. That meant how committed I was to this job.
What were you going to say, Diana?
I don't remember, but I think to summarize this, you know, section of the book, I was going to say that, you know, still today you need to be a team player in many jobs. So I don't think that that's necessarily a concern, except maybe in how they said it to him, right?
I would guess they did not define be a team player in a way that would have been incredibly helpful for him.
Yeah.
Sorry, Diana. You go ahead.
You know, I know we're trying to summarize here. So I think he really liked the work that he was doing in this area. It allowed him to be creative, but you guys have heard of the Peter principle, right? It's like where you get promoted up out of the good job that you're doing into a whole other type of job. That's what happened here, is he was good at what he was doing and he got promoted up, and suddenly he was supposed to be managing people. And then, you know, looking back, he was contrasting what this experience was like for him, where suddenly most aspects of his job were really, you know, socially challenging things for him, and comparing that back to what his life had been like working with the bands. And that was so free form, and they were a lot more accepting of his eccentricities, but it didn't have the stability that he kind of needed in order to grow up in the way that one does when you're 22 or however old he was. But the way in which he had to operate within like the 9-to-5 world was a lot more challenging for him. And I think he, looking back on his life, kind of felt bad that was, he wasn't able to like get his footing there.
That's true. But some of that had to do with the environment as well, because later on, when he sort of moves out of the corporate world, he leaves Milton Bradley, he goes to all these other, you know, electronics companies and starts his car dealership, his garage for like the high-end cars. He has to be the boss again. And maybe it's because he gets to actually do the job he likes as part of that. Maybe it's because he's older and he's able to sort of reflect on what worked. Maybe it's because he's in charge of the environment.
Well, that's what he said, right?
Yeah.
He specifically said, I am the manager here, but I impart the values on my employees. Like, what I value is what is important in my company, and so I show up for it.
Yeah. But again, it was the environment even though probably the behaviors that he would have needed to do to be a manager at Milton Bradley or whatever probably were pretty similar.
Mhm.
But in that other environment, he was able to engage in the skills. He was able to, figure it out.
Mhm.
Well, and I think he hints also at the fact like there's the VP who has some problematic behavior that I don't want to go into. Like being a team player can mean maybe he wasn't willing to put up with like stupid stuff that
Yeah.
superior, like immoral stuff that superiors were doing, which is an important like sort of flag to say. Like being a team player can often mean you don't let me get away, or you're too good at what you do and you make me look bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point,
like,
Alan.
Yeah.
Because team player doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Outside of the context of and knowing it was the 70s and 80s, who knows what that
Right.
team playership was going to look like.
Yeah. The story where he plants the shaved formica as
Mhm.
cocaine is a classic
That sounds painful.
anecdote.
Mhm.
Yes, and the guy people were
But the guy kept
snorting
coming back
the-
to snort his
It's a great
formica.
story. Everyone should go read that part of the book. It's really, really incredulous that occurred.
So
So yeah, there was a high level of motivation
Mhm.
in his own automotive company to be the boss, and it's different to be your own boss than to be doing what other people are telling you to do.
Mhm.
Some people, I think, are gonna succeed at being their own boss in a different way than they might if they're trying to fit into the corporate realm. And we also should not neglect the fact that he had, continued to grow and mature just as we all do
Right.
as we advance through our lives.
And that's
he
a step-
talks about that.
I think that's a step
too.
that we often forget a lot of times because we're working with the person at a specific point in their life. But the idea that no matter the disability or the impairment of the individual, they're going to keep growing and changing because they're a human organism just like we are. We're all the same in that regard. And they have a whole life to lead, and you can't necessarily you can make some general predictions, but you can't know exactly where someone's going to be in 20 years. Because he brings up a lot of the idea that what he wanted out of life and what his motivations at life were, they shifted as he went through all of these experiences, and depending on what they were, it helped affect change in his own behavior, as well as just his general development of becoming older and then getting married and having a child of his own, and just all these environmental changes, continuing to shape his behavior in different ways. So, again, he finally gets to his diagnosis. I think this is, again, a chapter that's kind of good to read in terms of that experience. I certainly hope I never have to be the person to say, you know what you should do? Check the DSM, buddy. I think you want to read up on this chapter. It reminds me of you. But it all worked out, at least for him and the gentleman who had recommended that he look into DSM to see if maybe he would fall on the autism spectrum. I thought it was funny that even John, when he heard, like, I think you may be autistic, his first thought was, you mean like the kid from St. Elsewhere who, spoiler alert for St. Elsewhere, imagined the whole show in his snow globe. Like, that was sort of the view of autism at the time. And like that was his view too, of this side character on a show.
I think he says it expertly, and in this, I did not ever want to be alone. And
Mhm.
everyone else, all the psychologists, were dead wrong.
Yes.
I think he found it sounds like he found the diagnosis helpful in terms of not necessarily teaching him more about himself, but I think sort of, maybe, I don't know,
Putting
vindicating is the
parameters
right
around
word,
it.
but yeah.
For understanding
Framing
it.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
framing it. That's
Yes.
a better term. Thank you, guys. That's a much better term. He describes his love life, which was nice. He describes, being a young dad, and then he sort of wraps up, kind of bringing it full circle, just reflecting on the death of his father, which is sort of how the foreword starts in terms of his brother describing, the impetus to write this book being sort of thinking about his own life after the death of his father. So it kind of comes full circle, wraps up, and just.
And I will say
ends the book.
his wife, or the mother of Bear Cub, is Little Bear, who was the Heinlein loving. Like, I just to give people like a hint that like he does get some happy endings
Yes.
in this.
And then he unfortunately he divorces Little Bear, but and remarries. But apparently they all had a great relationship.
Yeah.
Little Bear died in 2014. I found, but like his second wife wrote a very nice piece about how their relationship as friends, even though you think of the ex-wife as being, well, that's not a good relationship, but apparently no, they got along great, and it seems like everything went well, at least as far as I could tell from some online posts and the end of the book. And that brings us to the end of Look Me in the Eye. So I guess final thoughts, final take-homes from everybody. Is this finally the first book club book that everyone is happy that we read?
I'm happy we read it. I think it
only took a year and a half.
I think it gives us a good insight into lives that are different than ours, potentially, right? And I think that never hurts. It never hurts to be open-minded, and it never hurts to gather experiences from clients that we may be working with to be better clinicians.
And to touch back on what Jackie's point at the beginning of, and sort of expand upon it, I really hope that we get memoirs and experiences and perspectives on autism, on all sorts of different life with different diagnoses, from not just people who lived in white middle class America, that we as a modern society can hear about, like, well, what was life like in the 80s and 90s for a person of color who may have had autism or ADHD and grew up with those things. Like, making sure that those people have a platform and get to be heard as well is also very important. That was
and women on the spectrum as well.
Women on the
spectrum, very different
yeah.
experience too. Sorry to interrupt you, Alan.
No, that's quite all right. I interrupt you all the time, Diana, because I can't see you, so I apologize.
We need one of those 360 cameras. Diana, what were your thoughts?
I enjoyed reading this book. I love that he was unapologetically himself throughout the book. I think it's important for us to remember this is one account, right? So we're not attempting to make vast generalizations from this one account, but it is so helpful to read first-person perspective. And like Alan, I hope to continue reading more of those. And Rob, you included a quote here in the notes, which is quite nice, related to when he got his diagnosis. It's not a disease. It doesn't need curing. It's just how you are. And like I said, it was unapologetically throughout the book from that perspective. It's a good read.
All right, good. We got it. We got a winner, everyone. We did it. We got a book we all had a good time talking about. Thank you all very much for listening to our Look Me in the Eye book club discussion. We really hope you got something out of our discussion and perhaps even are inspired to read the book yourself and see if your take on it is the same as any of our takes on it. We are all very positive on this book. I think if you've listened to some of our previous book clubs, you know that's not always the case. So it is sort of nice to have that confluence of good vibes. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure that you get the second secret code word. It is Cubby, Cubby, whether it's the name that John sort of gave to his son, sort of a nickname, or whether you're thinking of the old Mouseketeer, Cubby, or just something that you might call a little bear, I guess. Either way, Cubby is our last code word. Thanks to Jackie and Diana, and of course to Alan for joining us for our book club this week. And thank you so very much for choosing to support us on Patreon. We wouldn't be able to do these extra long book clubs without you. So thank you so very much for doing so. We hope you enjoy this one. We'll be back sometime in the spring with our next book club, and our regular episodes will be coming out very shortly as well. But until next time, keep responding. Bye.